Welcome to Do Better Research, a learning-focused podcast about research methods. My name is Dr. Suzanne Aubrey, and I'll be guiding you through research methods to become a better researcher, both for academic study and professional practice. In this episode, we'll be talking about research ethics. We'll be speaking to Fiona Ellis, co-founder of Survivors in Transition, a Suffolk-based charity who support men and women who have experienced sexual abuse in childhood. As you can imagine, Fiona has a range of ethics experience, not only from her role within SITS, but also as a member of the University of Suffolk Institutional Ethics Committee. We'll also be speaking to Dr. Will Thomas, Associate Professor of the Suffolk Business School, about his research and the importance he places on an embedded approach to ethics. When universities talk about research, it's very often to remind researchers and students that they need to gain ethical approval to complete primary research. But as we will hear in this episode, ethics is much more than that. It's about how we treat others and ourselves throughout the whole research process, from the design of a project all the way through to the write-up on what we do with the data we have left at the end. Sometimes people and organisations get ethics wrong. In 2014, Facebook, along with academics from Cornell and the University of California, incurred public and academic wrath when they published details of a vast experiment in which it manipulated information posted on 689,000 users' homepages, and found it can make people feel more positive or negative through the process of emotional contagion. Maybe you're one of the Facebook users whose homepage content was manipulated. You wouldn't necessarily know, however, because Facebook's terms and conditions stipulate they don't have to tell users or seek their consent if they conduct an experiment like this. Facebook's attitude is just one example of a commonly held view that research conducted online doesn't have to be constrained by the ethical considerations involved in research conducted offline. We will see, however, in a later episode of this podcast, how this just isn't the case. Think about how you would feel if you learned that you've been deliberately manipulated in such a way. Does it anger or upset you? Or are you not that bothered? Even if you aren't that concerned by how Facebook have used you and your data, you can hopefully see why others might be, and what some of the abuses could be. Manipulating a person's emotions has a range of possibilities, and not all are good. Think back, for example, to the Milgram experiment, which measured the willingness of study participants to obey an authority figure who instructed them to perform acts conflicting with their personal conscience. I'll put a link for that study in the show notes. So Fiona, thank you so much for joining me on the Do Better Research podcast about ethics. It's great to have you here. I really appreciate your time. Can you just outline a little bit about your role and background for the listeners?
So I'm the chief exec of a local Suffolk charity called Survivors in Transition, who support adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse. In terms of my involvement with ethics, I'm involved with the ethics committee at the university as the lay member. So I guess in some senses, when I was first approached, it was just about keeping it real, really. I don't tend to come at things from an academic perspective necessarily. It's more about pragmatic stuff that we've encountered in practice. So that's the sort of input that I have into the ethics committee. In addition to that, we've done a couple of pieces of joint research with the university, a couple of big pieces of research in the past. So obviously I've got experience of submitting things through the ethics committee as well.
So obviously I sit on the ethics committee with you and have discussions about the kinds of projects that come through. You talk about sort of keeping it real. From what kind of perspective do you approach understanding the ethical considerations of some of these research projects? Is it about what's best for the institution or what's best for the participants or the researcher?
It's absolutely about the participants for me and from my perspective. Sometimes I think, specifically or not, sometimes those are the participants in a research project are the ones that get forgotten from an academic perspective. There's so much to consider when you're doing a research project. I think it's really easy to sort of forget the people at the core of it, and to ensure that not just that the boxes are checked, but genuinely to check that you're safeguarding them, that they're really well informed throughout the process, and critically that they've got to get out as soon as they feel uncomfortable about anything or unsure about anything. But more than anything, it's encouraging researchers to develop a real relationship if they've got, subjects involved in their research. I think that's really important.
It's a really good point about that relationship development, isn't it? That,
Yeah.
It's not just about participant researcher. There is an interplay there. There is an interaction there that's a really important part of the whole process.
Definitely. And I think it's more about doing with people than doing to people. And I think that, one of the things hopefully most researchers find is that if there's a different sort of attitude or approach, you're actually likely to elicit better, more honest responses from people rather than kind of canned responses that people are telling you what they think you want to hear. So I think that relationship development is absolutely critical.
Again, that's a really good point, isn't it? That research is done with and not to.
Yeah.
I mean, particularly for students of business, but social sciences, we're rarely doing things like medical experiments. We're not doing things that require trial, and they're taking a placebo. Control groups, there you go. Yeah. That's the word I'm looking for.
You see, there's so much to consider.
I know, absolutely. We're not doing control groups and it's about building that relationship so that you said the participants do know what they're getting themselves into for. They know what we're doing, and ultimately the research we try and do is to benefit them. So it's important for them to be part of it, not just it done to them.
Absolutely. And I think that, that ownership is a really, really good point, because I mean, I know from my own experience, if someone gets hold of me, if I get a cold call and someone asks me my opinion, I want to know what my opinion is going to do. Is it going to make a difference? Is it just going to sit in a report on a shelf somewhere? And I suppose I always relate it to the service users that we have at SIT. And I guess we're asking them to talk about some of the most difficult things that have happened to them. And for me, two things need to happen around that. A, we need to ethically ensure that they're safeguarded through that process, that process of, that research has been through some kind of a quality assurance process. But in some ways, more importantly, that they have some ownership over that and they can feel like they're making a difference. So it's more proactive than just being just a participant in research, and explaining to them how important their views are. And that's just about giving people some sort of value and ownership through the process, I think.
I love what you say there about it being a process. That the idea of ethics isn't just what we see in the ethics committee. It isn't just that piece of paperwork that we sign off as saying, yes, this primary research can continue, or no, it needs more work. The ethics is embedded at every point of the design and data collection and then beyond. So the kind of the results and what is done with those results.
Absolutely. And I don't think you can impress that point enough, that ethical stuff is embedded at each point in the process and needs to be considered at every sort of juncture in terms of someone's research plan. It really needs to be thought through. And I think, one of the things I always think we get as an organization, I think particularly in the last 5 years probably, an inordinate amount of requests to be involved in all sorts of research. So PhD research projects, large-scale research projects with the independent inquiry. I mean, there's such a range of them. And I've been really mindful that we've needed to develop some sort of framework around that to ensure that any research we get involved with and potentially expose our service users to is quality assured and has been through a robust ethical process. Otherwise, we just won't touch it with a barge pole, because I think people, we've seen time and time again in terms of research projects, you kind of get into this phase where suddenly everything comes together and you kind of need to crack on and do it. So we often get quite rushed requests for, we need to do this research and we need to engage with 30 survivors by this time next month. And we just always kind of kick that back and slow it down and say, okay, well, there are some processes internally that we have to go through. And I think that's something just for people to be mindful of when they're approaching organizations or potential subjects, to ensure that it's not sort of forced upon them, that there's a good lead-in terms of time. And that's all about planning, I think, really effective planning through your research project.
That's such a good point. And I think it's one of those things that is also really important for students to remember. I mean, thinking about, as you say, that some of these projects are under time constraints. They're, suddenly something just needs to get done, data needs to be collected, but you've got to really think about how you're engaging those organisations and thus the people that work in or with those organisations, in your case the service users. It's quite an important point to take that step back and think about it from a process perspective.
Definitely. And I think almost in a sense you need to put yourself in service users' shoes and think about how you feel when you receive, I mean, we don't get PPI calls anymore, but how you felt when you used to get those. Nobody liked that, being put in that process. So it's really about thinking about how it feels to be in that position and to be asked the things that you're asking.
So you talked about, I know this wasn't one of the questions that I asked, and I'm sorry, but thinking about something you said earlier, you talked about you've done some research projects with the university or sort of, and using the university ethics committee ethics process to design some of these research projects that you've done with your organisation, with your service users. Would you be able to outline one of those research projects and why you think it's important as an organisation to do research?
For us as an organisation, it's been an absolute game changer in terms of opening doors to funders, commissioners, different relationships, gaining credibility and kudos within our sector. It's absolutely changed things immeasurably for us as an organisation. So we're currently doing our third piece of research with the uni. The first one I'll just touch on briefly was a national online survey of survivors of sexual abuse, trying to better ascertain their journeys through particularly health pathways and understanding around disclosure points and trigger points within the system. That was a really successful piece of national work. We then decided from that, and the piece I'll talk a little bit more about because there's sort of more ethical consideration too, is within our service users at SIT, we recruited, I think it was 28 subjects to take that national survey and do a more in-depth piece of work with them around their experiences through health, particularly mental health services, what that had been like. And again, just really drilling down into the detail of what services they'd accessed, how long they'd been involved for, how did they feel they were treated through that. So we conducted in-depth interviews with subjects within our organisation. And that was obviously went through ethics approval at the time. And I think, really, really important at that juncture, if you're doing any kind of interviews or face-to-face or talking to people, that ethical stuff, you just can't kind of underplay it at all. It's you've got to have it absolutely right. And one of the things I particularly enjoyed is some of the feedback and the commentary back from the ethics committee in terms of had we considered this or would we consider that. It just gave us a completely different spin. And given that that committee is made up of a number of different people, it brings a number of different perspectives to your consideration. So, we never saw any of that as kind of negative or trying to stop our research. Actually, continually, it was seen as contributing to the quality of our research. Which really helped us kind of fine-tune the process in terms of talking to people about their experiences and the levels of sensitivity around the subject matter. We were talking to people about not necessarily their experience of sexual abuse, but undoubtedly we couldn't avoid that through the interviews. We needed to ensure that we had support in place for people should they disclose something or become distressed through that process. We needed to ensure that our interviewers were also really well trained and well supported through that process, because some of the stuff that they were hearing was particularly difficult and emotive. So we needed to ensure that there was support in place for them. And the whole way around the process, just keeping on sense checking that we had all the right things in place to ensure everyone was supported through that process.
I just want to pick up on two really good points you make there around ethics. The idea that the ethics process isn't just a box ticking exercise, but it contributed to the quality of your research, in the fact that it was sense checking, it was giving you more avenues of ideas, like making you think a little bit more deeply about some things. I think that's a really important point. But also the idea that the interviewer might need to be supported. So the person collecting the data might need some additional support in how to do that and the kinds of situations that they might come across. I think that's a fantastic point.
Definitely. And I think it's one that's underestimated all of the time. Researchers think quite often that they've got their head around their subject matter They know quite a lot about it. But in my experience, something's always going to come up that's going to throw you a little bit. And I think if you put that support in place from day one, it's just that confidence building around that you do have somewhere to go and someone to talk to about things that may have impacted you. And I think important to recognize that those things might not impact you at the time. It might be, we found with some of our interviews, it was days later or even weeks later. Stuff just wasn't leaving them. And they kind of needed a place just to put that or chat it through. And I guess to be reassured that it was perfectly normal that they were having the response they were, given the subject matter that they were discussing. And for me, that's just a confidence thing. What we never wanted to do was have anyone in a position where they felt like they were asking a silly question or they didn't feel confident to get support if they needed it. And I think that's really important.
I think you're absolutely right. And from the student perspective or from the researcher perspective, that could be as simple as having a critical friend to talk to about it, or their supervisor, or for you, it might be the researchers that are actually collecting the data, and that person be you or partners within the university. So just having someone there that they can go to if they need anything.
Definitely. And I think it just negates that feeling of, I should be able to deal with this. I'm not quite sure why I'm not dealing with it so well. And I think that if that's just in place from the get-go, it makes accessing that kind of support so much easier. It just becomes a seamless part of the process rather than something people have to overthink or feel unequipped to deal with, really.
Fiona, that was fantastic. Thank you so much.
No trouble at all, honestly. Happy to be involved.
Well, thank you very much for joining me for a second time on the Do Better Research podcast. I'm quite confident that it will work this time.
It's an absolute pleasure.
So we'll get straight back into it, and you know the routine by now. So what is it that you enjoy about doing research?
I think the thing that I really enjoy is just kind of satisfying a natural curiosity, really, by which I mean I'm nosy. So I'm kind of inquisitive and curious about the world around me and about people around me. And research for me is a way of satisfying that, of just trying to understand other people's point of view a little bit better, try to understand how people think, and to look towards, I suppose, answering questions about how better management might improve things for employees and for customers. And through that, there's this kind of thread of relationships, really. I'm interested in the relationships between employees and managers and between companies and customers, and thinking about how we can improve those. So where the problems in those relationships might be, and what improvements or solutions might look like.
I like the idea that you're naturally nosy, and I think that comes across from a lot of researchers that I've been interviewing. We are a nosy bunch.
We are indeed, yeah. I mean, I'm quite happy to stand at the window and sort of watch the world go by and watch what people are doing. And yeah, I think people who are nosy, who kind of naturally curious, I think they're drawn towards kind of research. They always have questions about why things are as they are. And so I'm not at all surprised, really. I mean, it is a comfort to know that I'm not sort of abnormal.
You're not alone.
In that way, yeah.
So you have quite a varied number of research projects that you've been engaged with. I know that you're engaged, you particularly tend to engage with organisations outside of academia, so you're quite applied focused in your research interests. But I wondered if you could outline what your favourite research project has been and why.
Yeah, I mean, so you're right. I've worked with a number of different organisations and in a number of different settings. I think the favourite project so far has been one where we were looking at the experience of older shoppers for the co-op. So the East of England Co-op commissioned us to have a look at the experience that older shoppers were having. And one of the things I really liked about it was that the co-op were absolutely determined that they wanted to make a meaningful difference. And they really wanted to see benefit from this work. I think it's very easy, particularly in some of the work that I've got caught up with, to be standing on the sidelines and kind of making criticism, throwing metaphorical stones, and not to be getting involved with the other side, which is, well, it's not enough for us just to point out how things are wrong and how things are flawed, but to think about how things might be improved. So one of the aspects of that work, I think, was the co-op's commitment, really, to wanting to do something with that research. And They were really interested in how we were going to go about working with older people. They helped us to recruit people. They wanted to listen to our findings and our suggestions. And, I think that benefited them because they were able to kind of take those on board and to think about them and to respond to them, not to do everything we recommended. But they have brought in new training. They have really thought about the type of support they can give, for example, to older people with mobility issues, who might be a bit more frail, not as able to sort of wander around stores endlessly, that kind of thing, and also to think about memory issues of various sorts as well. And I think that really illustrates the joy, really, of working for a commissioner, working for an organisation that comes with a blank sheet of paper, that doesn't really have preconceptions about what they're looking to find out, and is prepared to engage with researchers who can have these kind of open-ended conversations with people. And in our case, to hand over some of the control to participants. It's something that I'm really keen to do and to explore. I think there's benefit in engaging the client group, if you like, or the participant group in shaping some of the research, that not assuming that you come into the project knowing everything and having all the answers, even the answers to how we're going to find stuff out. So I think the kind of various aspects of that project that make it stand out and make it one that sticks in my memory, but I'm also really pleased to have been a part of.
It really sounds like the co-op had similar values to you. I mean, at the beginning you said that you really wanted to make a difference, you wanted to make positive difference to people's lives, and the co-op approached the project in a similar way. They really wanted to improve the experience of that group of their customers.
Yeah, and that is, I'm not a historian of the co-op by any stretch, but I mean, that is why the co-op was founded, on these principles of being there for its members. And, the East of England co-op still retains those principles very strongly. So I think that, that sort of explains why they took that approach, why they wanted to engage with the research in that way, is because, the principle on which they were founded is to be there to support their members rather than being there to make money for faceless shareholders.
And you talked about handing control to participants, and I know that that's something that you're looking at exploring a little bit further in terms of kind of participatory research. And when we've talked about this research project before with the co-op, you talk about emancipatory research. I wonder if you could just outline a little bit about what that means and what that might look like.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the principle of participatory research is engaging with the group of participants in terms of shaping how you're going to do the research. So maybe engaging a group of participants to determine the shape of questions or interview prompts or even a survey or whatever that might be used to find out more about the topic in question. And in this case, how people shop, what people's experiences of food and diet are. The idea of emancipation is just taking that a little bit further and really to explicitly seek to give greater voice to groups that might otherwise struggle. And often we refer to hard to reach groups. And I think there's something problematic in that term, really, because it puts us as the researcher at the heart of the problem. There are groups of people that we struggle to engage with, and therefore those groups are hard to reach. And often I think actually it's really the other way around, is that we are struggling to find ways to sort of listen to those people and engage with them in a way that is meaningful for them. A lot of the things that we talk about in research methods classes are not things that would instantly be recognizable to people outside of academic settings. Yet when you break them down and think about what we really mean by those, then they make a great deal of sense. We talk about reliability and validity and sort of concepts about how we generate knowledge, ontology and epistemology, and those are things that mean nothing to people outside academia, more or less. But if you express them in terms of the quality of information, then it's very easy for people to get to grips with what you're trying to find out. And I think emancipatory research is about saying, how can we find ways to give voice to people that otherwise are struggling? So to refuse this idea of hard to reach groups, and instead to say, we're going to go out of our way to listen to people who are not generally speaking listened to, and to put ourselves in service of those people, really, as part of that research project, to find a way to give voice to their ideas. And you're right. I mean, I think that is something that is tremendously important. And, it comes down back to this idea of being interested in relationships, and if we want to make those relationships more productive, then the first thing I think we need to do is to listen to the experiences of the people that we're engaging with, and really to engage with those, and trying as far as possible not to bring our preconceptions to at least the initial parts of those conversations, to strive to engage with them as someone who is maybe a little bit naive. They are the expert in their condition and their lives, rather than us as researchers. We need to be very conscious of that kind of power dynamic. Us as researchers coming from the university, often with PhDs, maybe with titles which are potentially sort of imposing. We need to remember that, and we need to do what we can to make it easy for people to engage with us and feel welcome to engage, and feel kind of respected for the opinions and ideas and knowledge that they have.
It's really interesting that you use the word power, because I was talking to, in the other interview for this podcast, I talked to Fiona from SITS, Survivors in Transition, and she talked about the relationship between researcher and participant, and handing that power back to the participant, and making sure that we as researchers don't come to research from a position of hierarchy where we see ourselves as above the participants and knowing more about the subject. As you said, the participant is the expert in their own experience.
Yeah, and I think that is a really good summary of exactly what I would think as well. I think particularly when you're working with groups like that, I think it's really important that the job of the researcher is to listen to the experience of the person who is giving up their time to take part in the research. In a qualitative setting, in a sort of qualitative approach, in some ways that is more straightforward. I think it is still possible in quantitative research, we all get them confused, that to do something similar, and to engage with the participant group in terms of setting up, how the data collection works. But yes, I mean, particularly if you're doing anything that feels like interviews, focus groups, the challenge is to find a way to make the participant feel comfortable in sharing their experience with you, and then to listen attentively to that experience.
So in a slightly circuitous route, because I realised that I've kind of asked questions that I hadn't kind of pre-sent to you, so I'm going to try and get myself, not you, but myself, back on track. I wonder if you could outline what research ethics means to you. And I know we've touched base on quite a lot of the aspects, but if you could kind of summarise it for the listeners.
Yeah, so I mean, I think rule one is treating participants and potential participants with dignity and respect. And I don't think you go far wrong if you think about it in that, really kind of classical way, which is, how would you like to be treated yourself? What sort of information would you need before agreeing to take part in a research study? So informed consent is a really important idea, that we give information to people that is sufficient for them to be able to understand what we're looking to do, why we're looking to do it, what being involved will mean, particularly in terms of their time and other commitments. I don't do research which is sort of sticking needles in people or testing drugs on them or anything like that. That comes with its own specific issues around consent. But it is nevertheless really important that participants know what the study is. And, it might be details like who's paying for the study, what are they looking to do with it. So I've been very fortunate, entirely speaking, to have worked for organisations commissioning research who have taken a fairly open stance in terms of what they're looking to find out, and haven't sought to try and hide results or anything like that. But that can be a problem in some sorts of research. It's certainly a problem in pharmaceutical research. So informed consent, really important. Health and safety, really important. It's clearly unethical to put participants in a position of being at risk in any way. So whether that's physically, emotionally, or any other way, but also the researcher. One of the important jobs of an ethics panel is to also protect the researcher and to make sure that they're not doing anything which is dangerous. And I think there's also, and it's increasingly a problem, I think, around protecting data and identity and being really clear how data is going to be used with participants, where it's going to be shared, in particular, who's going to get access to raw data or identifiable data, anything like that. But when we come to write up our studies, thinking back to those promises that we've made and ensuring that participants are not going to be identifiable if we've promised that. So I think all that really is summarised by the idea of dignity and respect. And then this kind of increasing concern that I have, which is to say, how do we get participants to be more actively involved in setting the direction of the study, in determining the type of conversation or the type of data collection, for example. You can imagine studies where there are multiple types of data collection that would reflect the preferences of different sorts of people that are participating. Some people might like to be interviewed. Actually, my experience is people are pretty flattered to be asked to be interviewed, whether it's for a podcast or a research study or whatever it is. People like the idea that their opinions are valuable. Some people might not like to be interviewed. They might prefer to write their responses or to talk through images or whatever it is. But in thinking about methods of data collection, and I think not necessarily in every project, but in many projects, there will be a power issue where we should be aware of those power imbalances, even if it's a kind of an imbalance between a researcher coming in, perhaps where the participants see them as being expert and very knowledgeable and highly trained and very well qualified. And, that can be an issue, I think, where we come in from that university background. I think many people who are not from university backgrounds expect and think of university lecturers, professors, whatever, as being much more knowledgeable and well trained and what have you than they really are. So I think it's our job slightly to kind of break that image as well. I'm not sure that was a summary of what I thought.
And yet it was still a really, really good outline of the kinds of things that we expect in a research project. And actually, I wanted to go back to one of the comments you made about sort of when it comes to write-up, because I know that students, in some extent, universities think of ethics as a process for going through an ethics committee, but it's not, is it? It's much more than that. It's much more embedded in the whole research project, not just a kind of a box-ticking exercise.
Yeah, and it's not just students. I think there is a sense, no matter how much we like to think that we're not in this position, where everybody thinks about ethics as being the process of getting approval. I complete the form, I submit the form, and someone says yes, and that's job done. And that is really important. And most universities will be very clear that there is a process to get approved, and you must get approval before you do your research. And if you do otherwise, then you put yourself at risk of some sort of penalty. So that is true. But actually, I think you're right that ethical research is much more than that. It is about making sure, firstly and really simply, you do what you have promised to do. If you've promised to secure informed consent in a particular way, then you do that. That you have that conversation, you provide that information, you get the necessary forms signed. But actually, the process of consent is an ongoing process. It may well be the case that, in the course of a conversation with someone, you become aware that they're uncomfortable or that they might become upset in some way, or visibly upset, or maybe distracted, or whatever. And I think it's important to engage with them and to maybe have a conversation about whether they're still happy to keep going. Often they will be. Maybe they want a break, but it could be that someone feels like they consented to take part in something, and it wasn't quite what they expected, and actually they are now uncomfortable and they're struggling to find a way to to say that. So I think it's really important that as researchers we make sure that we understand ethics as being a process that sits, or part of the research process. It sits alongside the study for the duration of the study, and indeed after the study's finished, getting rid of data in the proper manner, making sure that we're not, leaving people's personal details lying around, that we're not keeping hold of information longer than we need to. And yet the kind of flip side of that is also true. Many research projects will have conditions where the data that has been generated in an anonymous fashion has to be lodged in a repository so that other people can listen, read transcripts or whatever, and make use of that data in the future. And there's sort of, I think, an interesting ethical issue there, that we have a responsibility to people once they've agreed to give up their time to get maximum benefit from that. And it would be rather odd if we said, you've got to get rid of all the information. And if someone else in 6 months' time comes along and wants to investigate a similar sort of issue, they have to go out and find another bunch of people and go out and do another bunch of interviews, maybe even interview the same person again. That would be really odd. So there are interesting questions at every point in a research study about how we treat the people involved, how we treat their data, and how we balance security and protecting identity with getting the most from the contribution that they have made.
So can you outline a research study that you've conducted where the role of ethics played a really kind of important part of the design process of the data collection, not just as a kind of a box-ticking exercise to give you permission to do the research?
So this is a study from a few years ago now, but a colleague and I were asked by the County Council to do some work around what are called preventative services. And those are a range of different types of support provided to older people in order that they can stay living at home. In other words, that they don't need to go into residential care. So they could be anything from help with getting up in the morning, getting dressed, maybe shopping, could be with meals, with getting to bed, personal care, all sorts of things, really. And we were yet again really fortunate to be working with someone at the council whose view was, we want to do something interesting, and we don't want to just kind of repeat studies that have been done in the past. This is an area of work that is not research barren, if I can use that phrase. That's an odd phrase. But there's plenty of research out there about this, and yet we still felt there was something else we could do. And so we wanted to make sure that we involved older people and representatives of older people as widely as possible. And this was really kind of some of our early ventures into this idea of participatory research and maybe elements of that kind of emancipatory style as well. So the study was in two parts. The first was a kind of discussion between a number of different individuals and kind of representative bodies, companies, organisations, professionals, and some older people who were in a variety of different circumstances, about some of the issues that we thought should be addressed in the research. So asking them to reflect on their understanding and their experiences, either as people who provided services or as people who either received or were in a position where they might be receiving services. So we, as researchers, saw ourselves as kind of almost secretaries to that group. Our job, we met a couple of times, our job was to support the kind of discussion, to do a certain amount of making sure we stay on track, but also to think about whether there were data sources that we needed to access, could we provide information to that group that they wanted, and to allow the group, which we both kind of serviced and were part of, to arrive at a kind of agenda for conversations with those older people, and to agree what the methods should be, really, agree what our approach should be, not only in terms of conducting the research, but also in terms of getting a sample, finding people that we were going to try and speak to. And we were really fortunate that we were able to partner with a couple of voluntary groups to help us with that recruitment process, because that can be difficult. And one of the situations you can find yourself in is always working with the same individuals, because they are always quick to volunteer. They're people and you have their telephone number, or email address, or whatever. So that was really important. Once we'd done the data collection, which was interviews using the agenda that the group had identified, we came back and we tested ideas, and we tested some of the themes that we'd noticed back with the original panel. And that was, I think, a very valuable part of the process, because they were able to ask questions of us and ask questions of the data that we wouldn't have done. And it's one of those curious things about qualitative research, which is that different individuals will extract different ideas or different themes from the same group of data that reflect interests, education, circumstance, and so on. And we were able to sort of take advantage of that in a positive way, and to get their ideas and to, I think, strengthen the report that we were able to produce. So the report was produced largely by the researchers, but with this really valuable input of the panel. And then the final thing, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but I think is crucial, is that everybody who participated and helped with that research process received a summary of the findings. And I think that's very important, largely because, you're asking people to give up their time, and it is very easy to forget to kind of complete that circle and to include them back in the results, so they can see what came out of the work that they had been a part of. And if we want to make sure that people remain willing to take part in research studies, I think it is important that they can see that the input that they've had made a difference and did form part of the final report. It's by no means a perfect study. I don't think any study is perfect. We were really conscious about positioning ourselves, and about, in particular, not regarding ourselves as experts and trying to avoid giving anybody the impression that we saw ourselves as experts. Apart from anything else, we were two researchers who were a fair distance off the kind of older person's experience. Most of the quote unquote older people who were taking part were certainly older than 75, and both of us were 20 plus years off that. And so it would be very strange, I think, for anybody to have the impression that two academics 20 years off the age group of interest would have a more valuable insight than people who were really living through that experience. And that was a conscious, explicit part of the way in which we designed that. Now, that won't always be the case, certainly in kind of business school type research. Often we might be more willing to offer ourselves as experts for various reasons, but we need to be very conscious about what we're saying we have expertise in, particularly if we want people to engage with us and be open in the conversations that we're having.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Will. Thank you for joining me on the podcast again.
You're very welcome. Absolute pleasure.
Fiona and Will have a wonderfully empathetic approach to ethics in their work and research. Both come from very different perspectives and professional backgrounds, but they both talk about key concepts such as dignity, respect, and the balance of power. When thinking about your own research design, even if you're using secondary research, think about how you're collecting your data and using that. Are you making sure that both you and your participants are safe, physically and emotionally? Are you being honest about the research you're conducting and what you're going to be doing with the information that you've gathered? And finally, are you making sure you acknowledge that your participants, no matter what you're investigating, are the experts of their own lived experience? If your answers to all of these questions are yes, then you're most of the way to ensuring an ethical approach to your own research.